didn't stop them. They carried on. Nathan,
All right, let's begin. Let's do it. Yalla.
Exactly. Yeah, I need to change my energy.
Tell me at 25 and 35 or something.
25.
Roughly-ish.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Next up, Jennifer Windt, who's going to be talking about empty minds and sleep or wakefulness, cultivated and in the wild.
Okay, thank you. So firstly, before I begin, a huge thanks to Dean for putting this together and organizing this, and also to all of the speakers so far. It's really been, I think, an extremely colorful conference, an extremely fun one so far. I should also say it's my first actual real live non-Zoom conference since before the pandemic, so I've really been enjoying this. And probably also my last one for some time. So it's but really been a treat in many ways. I'd never really thought about nothingness as a topic per se. And I think what I'm saying will offer a particular perspective on what might be a certain version of it, but possibly also skirting around the edges a bit, but will hopefully be of interest to some. So most of my work, maybe just because this is such an or such a diverse group, so I'm really coming from the side of philosophy of cognitive science. I dabble quite a lot in empirical research, so most of my work is going to be drawing from empirical research. And I've also increasingly over the last years been engaging in collaborative interdisciplinary work and also some self-led empirical work. The topics that I work on are mostly sleep and waking, dreaming, mind-wandering, daydreaming. And this is then a bit of an extension beyond that because it's really looking a bit at topics related to dreamless sleep. So what really happens to conscious awareness when dreaming stops? Is it lights out on consciousness? What really happens when daydreaming and mind-wandering stop? Does the mind just blank? And what kind of state is that in relation to consciousness? And increasingly also looking at some contemplative research and meditation traditions, though that is not by any means my area of expertise. So I'm in Monash philosophy and now also in the newly founded center, Monash Center for Consciousness and Contemplative Studies, which and what you'll see in this talk is that I'm really trying to draw together these different themes in a new way, and this is a work in progress. So the topic that I want to talk about today then is really on its face inspired by largely anecdotal reports that superficially at least sound quite similar. So reports of states in which the mind is empty, pure, devoid of content, and kind of just noticing that these reports and descriptions sound quite similar coming from very different areas. So you get them on one hand from meditation states, deep meditative states, but something similar also seems to come up in work on mind wandering and mind blanking, attentional lapses and wakefulness, and also again something similar from certain areas of sleep and dream research. And at least initially I think that similarity is quite puzzling because in meditation these states are sought out, they're cultivated, they take effort, they usually take many years or at least many hours of practice, whereas in other cases like in mind wandering and sleep they can often occur spontaneously and out of the blue. So the question that I want to raise is there something deeper to this similarity? So do we really need some kind of common framework for thinking about these states? And that's really what I want to promote in this talk, is really just a common framework for thinking about them and proposing that is a question worth asking. I'll start out by offering a few conceptual distinctions. And the first distinction that I want to offer is one that will help us think about the different contexts and conditions in which these allegedly contentless, empty, or blank states of mind occur. And it's inspired by a botanical distinction between wild and cultivated plants. So we could roughly say that cultivated plants are plants that are subject to the application of any horticultural method that retains, selects, develops, or refines certain characteristics in a stable way, whereas wild plants are not subject to such methods. And likewise, we can then say that cultivated mental states are going to be mental states that are subject to the application of any contemplative method that retains, selects, develops, or refines certain characteristics in a stable way. And I won't say much more about what those ways are. Contemplative, roughly, I'll understand as using cognitive practices related to attention, awareness, memory, to refine one's own mental states. So that rules out pure experimenter tampering with your mind, though not completely. So it's cultivating your own mental states in a contemplative method, in a cognitive method, roughly, which will still be quite inclusive, and wild mental states are going to be states that are not subject to such methods. Now, this distinction is not intended to be comprehensive. It's probably not going to cover all mental states. And it's also, in particular, I won't be looking at Chris about drug-induced mental states. I also won't be talking about pathological mental states. I do think it would be interesting to think about how those examples might relate to the wild versus cultivated distinction that I'm proposing, and I think some of them might slot in and some might not, but that's not my focus today. I also don't think, I should say at the very beginning, that distinction works all the way in. In fact, I think it allows for a lot of borderline cases. And I think that in many ways, the borderline cases and the examples where that distinction between wild and cultivation breaks down are going to be the most interesting ones. So I'm totally fine with counter examples, and I think they will actually be helpful for the overall project. So the idea is really more to say that this is I think, fairly intuitive and I hope helpful distinction at the outset, but it's not going to be our endpoint. And in fact, I want to start out with an example of a plant, slightly tongue-in-cheek, that will work, that will actually show that distinction between wild and cultivated plants is not perfect, but allows for counterexamples. So this is the stingy nettle. It grows abundantly in certain forested regions, especially in Northern Europe. So having grown up in Germany, it's truly a memory of my childhood, encountering the stingy nettle. And this is because it has stingers. And when you brush up against it, it creates this really unpleasant and annoying burning sensation. So it's truly a wild plant, and I think it's fair to say that for most intents and purposes, it's a weed. It's not wanted, it's annoying. And yet, people use it to make tea and swear by its medicinal properties. They use it to make soups and other things. And to do so, they will harvest it using gloves to protect themselves, and they will also cultivate it. So it seems to be the kind of plant that really straddles, and it's the same kind of plant that can occur mostly in the wild, but also in pretty much the same way in cultivation. So how does this help? The question that we want to think about then is, are there different kinds of empty minds? Or is there just one kind of empty-mindedness that occurs across wild and cultivated conditions? And one way of thinking about that question then is whether empty-mindedness is kind of like the stingy nettle. So that would be one option. There's just one kind of empty-mindedness like the stingy nettle. It can occur in the wild or in cultivation. But regardless of how it occurs, of the context in which it occurs, certain relevant properties, and I'll leave to the side which properties exactly those are. This talk doesn't really matter. It's going to be broadly similar whether it occurs in the wilderness or in cultivation. There might be some differences, but it will be similar enough to speak of a common mental kind, as we would for the stingy nettle. And the other option then being that no, actually empty minds, whether they occur in different contexts, in different behavioral states, in the wild or in cultivation, are so different in certain relevant properties that we're actually going to want to pry them apart and form different mental kinds. options and not speak of them together. So I think, at least initially, both of those options are on the table. I'm going to lean towards the common kind answer. So I'm going to lean towards the position of saying there's one kind of empty mind that cuts across these different behavioral states and different conditions, but I'm not going to conclusively argue for that here. It's really more about raising the question and offering a framework for thinking about it. All right, so the next piece of conceptual background that I want to offer before going into some examples is the term of minimal phenomenal experience that has already been mentioned in a few different talks. So Ruben, you were talking about it, and Harald this morning. So this is a term, MPE, that I introduced back in 2015. So that was a commentary that I wrote inspired by this really beautiful chapter by Evan Thompson on dreamless sleep experience. So that chapter that he wrote, and I'll be returning to that a bit later, was really drawing from Indian philosophy, but also at the same time cognitive science of deep sleep, and thinking about whether we really need to take into account not just dreaming when thinking about consciousness occurring in sleep, but also something like dreamless sleep, what that might actually mean, and how that might then impact general definitions and theories of consciousness. So that was the direct root of inspiration. The other root of inspiration for that was a term that Blanca and Metzinger had coined in a TIX article, so a term of minimal phenomenal selfhood, by which they mean the simplest form of experiencing oneself as a self. So how, basically, what properties can you take away from phenomenal experience of selfhood and still speak of having the experience of being or having a self? And the idea for MPE then is to take that further and to say, well, you can still have phenomenal experience without the experience of being or having a self, whatever that might be, without subject-object duality. And that's a construct worth thinking about. So there have now been a number of positive proposals as to what exactly MPE might consist in, including one that I originally developed, including some ideas by Evan Thompson, and then a lot of work that you've already heard about by Thomas Metzinger, which is both theoretical and also empirical. And I'm going to leave these to the side. So I'm really going to want to use MPE for the purposes of this talk, just really as a technical tool for singling out what, if anything, is common to different states of empty-mindedness across all of the examples that I'll be discussing. So I think roughly by that I will just mean something, the simplest form of phenomenal experience that we can still conceive of and consistently describe as still being conscious, as still being a form of subjective experience. And I think the ability to report at least the occurrence of such experiences is absolutely central, because without it we would lose ability to empirically investigate this as a target phenomenon. So roughly that's all I want to say about MPE, and again, just using it as a placeholder for empty, blank, contentless, pure mental states, etc., and just using it as a technical term for now, because I think it's useful to have a term that is neutral, that is not already strongly associated with a certain line of research or a certain type of tradition. And it could well be, as I was saying, that in the end we'll want to break this apart and say, we've looked at meditation versus mind wandering, for example, and they're actually so different that we don't want to discuss them together, and that would be fine. All right, so for the rest of the talk, and one other caveat before I start into it. I think especially philosophers, and especially representationalist philosophers, will get concerned by the suggestion that there could be something like a contentless state of experience, and what that actually means, and whether that can be consistently described. So when I speak, I'll sometimes speak of, just for matters of simplicity, of contentless experience, and I'm not going to be using that in a very strong sense. So it really just describes MPE is contentless in the sense that there is an absence of certain types of imagery, of self-related experience, of propositional thought contents. But I don't want to commit to saying that there is an absence in MPE of any type of intentional content. So I'm pretty happy to consider minimal phenomenal experience as a minimally contentful state. And again, what exactly that content is a topic for a different talk, but I'm open to that possibility. And what I'll now do for the rest of the talk is try and fill in this table and try and take you on a tour of examples of minimal phenomenal experience that occur in the wilderness and in cultivation and in wakefulness and sleep, and suggest whether they might be similar or different. So that's the program for the rest of it. And a lot of the examples that I'll draw from will be quite selective, so I'm not going to give a comprehensive review of the literature, but really just largely draw from conveniently stuff I know or collaborations that I've been involved in. All right, so the first example will come from Cultivated Wakefulness, and specifically examples from meditation research, because I think that is kind of the intuitive place to start when thinking about these states. So states that then would be described as pure, non-dual, contentless stillness experiences or awareness, and that are typically regarded as the goal states in different meditation traditions. Now Rubin, there are a lot of different studies that I could be citing here. Rubin has already cited some of that work. And again, I'm not going to be comprehensive, but just be a bit lazy and talk about some work that I was involved in together with Olivia Carter and Toby Woods at Uni Melbourne. And this was part of Toby's PhD thesis that he was working on. And he's now continuing this project. I'll come back to that a little bit later. At M3CS at Monash doing a postdoc, so there's more to come. It's pretty cool stuff. So what Toby did was basically look in a series of papers published with Phenomenology and the Cognitive Sciences at 3 meditation traditions, so shamatha, transcendental, and stillness meditation. And those 3 were chosen because they're all quite different in origin, technique, in the purpose, but also in the speed and ease with which they attain the contentless goal states that they aim for. So without saying much more about those practices, shamatha is a practice that is focused on an object, so on the breath. Transcendental has a mantra that is repeated. And stillness meditation is a much smaller and much less known tradition. There hasn't been that much research on it so far. It's a tradition that Toby is very familiar with, that was founded in Melbourne, and it's a do-nothing practice. So it's a practice that deliberately involves letting go of any doing and any type of effort. So in that way, it is really quite different from the other 2. The method that he used was one of evidence synthesis. So he basically firstly identified 135 expert descriptions of the goal states and the path towards the goal states in these different traditions. So this is the actual pile of research that he looked at. And then from these texts, he basically identified these descriptions within these texts, formed a total of 65 different features that described the allegedly contentless goal states, and then compared them across the traditions. So what he found was firstly that across traditions, a number of features seem to be consistently absent across all 3 conditions. And these were things such as thoughts, perceptions, images, memories, concept, ego. So they were contentless in that sense, but a number of other features tended to be consistently present across the different traditions. And these were things such as wakefulness, naturalness, calm, bliss, joy, wholeness, and freedom. And the overall picture, I mean, I'm leaving out a lot of the more interesting details. This is really just a very rough characterization, but the bottom line to take from this is that what is described as contentless experiences or contentless states in these different traditions is not strictly contentless at all. There's actually quite a lot of content that is still present. It's certain everyday forms of content that tend to be consistently missing. There's also a pattern of broad similarity between the practices, but also a lot of some variation, and many open questions. So actually, for many, many features, it ended up being unclear as to whether they were the same or different across the different practices, which just largely stemmed from their not being sufficiently described, which I think from a perspective of progressing research and doing more work in this area is actually a very interesting result. Toby also did a participant-based study that's currently still under review, in which he looked again at 3 traditions, but slightly different ones. So again, shamatha, Thai forest, and stillness. And you can see here in the brackets that for each tradition he had 80 plus participants. So as I said, this was a questionnaire-based study assessing the deepest experience of stillness or silence that practitioners of these traditions had had. So that's not exactly the same as contentless experiences or the goal states. You would assume that the contentless states or goal states, if they had had them, would be the deepest experience of stillness or silence that they had undergone. But it's possible that more complex or earlier states were also described under that heading. These weren't novice practitioners, so for shamatha and Thai forest, these were all committed, dedicated practitioners. And for shamatha and Thai forest, they had all been participating in retreats, whereas stillness meditation does not do retreats. So these were people that had been practicing over a certain amount of time. I can't now remember how long, but could look it up. So again, we found a pattern of similarities across practices. So the deepest experience of stillness silence largely was described as highly positive, involving low awareness of thoughts, perceptions, images, various other forms of content, as well as a high degree of stillness, calm, peacefulness, ease, and mental relaxation. There were some differences, so most notably, and these are just examples, Thai forest was associated with significantly greater bliss and joy than shamatha.
Thai forest?
Hmm?
What is Thai forest?
I should know more about that, but I really would have to go back to the manuscript to give you more detail on Thai forest.
Well, it's a full
Sorry about
tradition
that.
of meditation, and they use many different meditation practices, but it's a tradition within Buddhism that's based in Thailand.
Okay, so we've got an average over a bunch of traditions.
So I sort of had a clarificatory question about
Yeah.
that too, because shamatha is not a tradition, right? It's a kind of practice
Yeah.
spread across multiple traditions. So it seems to be a
So I've been-
cross-cutting.
So he was looking at mainly Wallace for shamatha, so mainly the Alan Wallace literature.
Oh,
They
And
both practice shamatha in the Thai forest tradition.
because there are
too.
I think there are differences within shamatha between different experts, and he was, at least for the phenomenology and cognitive science, was really looking at the Wallace stuff, but again, you'd have to go to the full paper for the details. So the point being that we then we have some differences as well for stillness versus the other two, where stillness was described largely as less wakeful, more absorptive, but also having a greater quality of pure being and reaching a ground state of the mind. So that was the questionnaire stuff that came out of that. So I think just for now, in very broad strokes and excusing all of the messiness that and lack of background that I have on these different practices, the main point being overall similarity, not contentless, but also some variability both within and between the practices is kind of the bottom line that I'm trying to get to here. Also, maybe one further conceptual clarification from this, which is about the relationship between cultivation and spontaneity. You might worry that, especially for something like stillness being a do-nothing practice, that it doesn't quite count as cultivation because there is no particular state actively being induced or actively being prevented. And I think, in fact, that leads to a bit of an interesting clarification as to what cultivation does or does not admit of. So if we just go back to the definition that I proposed at the beginning, then cultivation is the application of any horticultural or contemplative method that retains, selects, develops, refines certain characteristics in a stable way. So we might want to say that at least on the botanical side, cultivation does not require planting a particular plant at a certain location. You could easily conceive of ways of having a plant that would count as cultivated even though it hasn't been planted in a particular place. And likewise, I think cultivation in regard to mental states does not necessarily require deliberately inducing or even preventing particular mental states during a session, during practice. So I think at least conceptually, we could say that, well, mental states that arise spontaneously at a given point in time during practice can still count as cultivated. There is not necessarily an opposition between those terms. And this is important to me for two reasons for moving forward. And the one is that it allows us to compare, more easily allows us to compare examples of cultivated and wild, spontaneously occurring mental states, but also really allows states that would otherwise be described as spontaneous to pop up within cultivation and even count as cultivated. There's also just one finding, again, from Toby's study. This was from one of the PCS, the Phenomenology and Cognitive Science papers, the reference is cutting off here at the bottom, was that there was a bit of an interesting tension between practices valuing stability of attention and focusing on one hand and allowing for spontaneous states such as mind wandering on the other hand. So within shamatha, as described by Wallace, you have a high value placed on stability of attention and focusing, whereas there is a tendency to regard mind wandering as a disruption of the practice. It's not really part of it, it's when you're not doing it successfully, in my understanding. Whereas in stillness, that is quite different. So in stillness, there's much less value placed on stabilizing attention and focusing, because that would be a form of doing that is not actually supposed to be part of stillness meditation. Whereas there seems to be much more openness to tolerating mind wandering and spontaneous fluctuations in thoughts and attention as part and parcel of what is meant to be happening during a practice session, to put it like that. Yeah, cool, thanks. That should be good. So to move on to the next example, so we've seen some variation and some similarity across different contemplative practices. So to move on to cultivated states occurring in sleep. And here we have superficially characterizations such as dreamless sleep experience, but also void, light, nothingness experiences, objectless experiences, witnessing sleep, clear light sleep. So these would just be different terms roughly used to pick out the target phenomenon. Here's Thompson from the paper I was mentioning earlier, who says, when we're deeply asleep, we don't really cognize anything. There's no object being cognized, no awareness of the I as knower. But we feel this absence while we sleep, and we remember it upon awakening. So it's a very special kind of absence. It's one that's felt and experienced, and that can crop up in certain meditation traditions. And here's some other descriptions from reports cited in some work by Adriana Alcaraz-Sanchez, published recently, of these states. So then the senses disappeared. I was just floating in nothingness. Also things like I was in a sphere of light. There was no sense of self. It was maybe a different me. So also some uncertainty as to whether there is or is not self-experience, and certainly also different things that one might mean by self-experience. So again, Alcaraz-Sanchez has published a few analyses based on these microphenomenological interviews with people that she has conducted, and it seems to be that at least in sleep, when the state happens, it's associated with either a lost or a reduced sense of self, depending on what one means by the sense of self, but also by a lack of visual and a lack of sensory and especially visual perception. There still is a presence of non-modal sensations, by which she seems to mean something, a state that is sort of like seeing but not quite seeing, sort of like hearing something but not quite hearing,
so maybe some kind of imagery type state. Also typically pleasant emotions, quiet and unfocused attention, awareness of the state as it unfolds. And also some dynamics, so she distinguishes certain sub-phases within nothingness as well as moving into and out of the nothingness phase, as she calls it. So again, I think just as a bottom line and in very broad strokes, there's overall reduced phenomenology. There's still an experience present, but also a lot of variability between people, but also within the experience itself. I should also say from a lot of this, and this should have been obvious from the very term of minimal phenomenal experience as well, that I'm not exactly sure, would be nice to chat more with Ruben about that actually, how that relates to all of the cessation experiences that you were talking about, because at least quite often when you were talking about it, it sounded like there was a complete cessation of phenomenal experience. So in the sense of there being nothing, it is like to be in that state, whereas in the states that I'm talking about, there would still be that basic subjective character, just in a very reduced way. And maybe to give one more example that goes into the area of lucid dreaming and also gives an example of a transition between what I would consider minimal phenomenal selfhood arising within a lucid dream, so a dream where the dreamer realizes that they are dreaming and is often able to exercise some degree of dream control, and where they then move into a state of minimal phenomenal experience, or what I would consider as such. So this is just an anecdotal dream report, but I think it nicely captures what I'm after, and also, anyway, so here it is. So I'm suspended in dream space. There's no dream body anymore. I'm just a dot of pure consciousness suspended. Then there's a feeling of peace and gentle infinite expansion. So there's something that's happening on the level of spatial experience. And self-location, sense of expansion increases. I'm no longer a single dot of consciousness. So I would say the point where she is still a dot of consciousness, that would still qualify as a minimal self, right? You're still identifying with something. It's a very non-standard self, but it is still something where one would say there is an I, but then that dissolves as well. All the dots are me and I am them. There is no I or them, we are one, a blissful sense of timelessness and oneness merging with the light. So, flowery language, but basically indeterminate sense of self-location, spatial experience, and also time experience has not completely disappeared, but grown quite indeterminate. And then after an indefinable length of time, there's then the weight of body returns. There's kind of a return to more standard and wakeful embodied self-experience. So I think that's kind of nice because it shows that dynamic and that transition. It also shows, I think, that cultivation could occur in the context, for example, also of lucid dream training oneself to become aware of the fact that one is dreaming and possibly tampering with how one experiences the self in a dream. So cultivation is open to that. But with that, we'll move on to examples of MPE or potential MPE occurring in the wild. And again, the example will be in sleep. So the next question, I think, then is whether something like this will occur outside of the context of any kind of contemplative tradition, including lucid dreaming, and non-lucid dreamless sleep. And again, here I'll draw from the paper from Thompson. And here he describes sleep more generally, dreamless sleep, as creating a gap or rupture in consciousness. And the point being that we often feel that gap immediately upon awakening. So the sense that we were just asleep and unknowing, having a deep dreamless sleep, is not outside knowledge. He says it's inside first-hand experience. We're aware of the gap in consciousness from within our consciousness, is how he describes it. And he actually uses that to distinguish two kinds of self-experience. On one hand, embodied self-experience, or the feeling of bare sentience, of being sentient, which he thinks would persist in these states. So he would, unlike me, regard these as states that still allow for some kind of basic self-experience, namely sentience, whereas I would, under certain conditions, say that they are selfless. But then he also says, but what is lost in these states is autobiographical experience of being a person with a certain storyline. And that is what we lose. But there's still conscious experience. So if that is true, then we have something like MPE and deep dreamless sleep quite often when we awake with the feeling of having slept dreamlessly and peacefully and for a certain period of time. It's also something, or I think a candidate for MPE in wild sleep is also something that in dream research is called white dreaming. And white dream reports are typically defined as reports where people say they're awakened typically in the sleep laboratory, but you can also get this at home. And they have the impression of having had experiences during sleep, but they can't recall or report any more details. So on its face, that's all that the phenomenon is. And it's quite interesting to see that white dream reports will be reported from all stages of sleep. And what you can see here, it's a bit small, but this is N3, so this is the deepest part of non-REM sleep, slow wave sleep, which for a long time was thought to be lights out unconscious, dreamless sleep. And what you can see here is that even N3 leads to quite variable forms of reports upon awakening in the sleep laboratory. So these are two studies that performed serial awakenings. So that means that participants are awakened every 15 to 30 minutes in the lab and then asked to report anything that they were experiencing just before being awakened. And what you can see here is that even in N3 you get relatively high proportions of the light gray area, which is conscious experience or dreaming, roughly a third. So it is not a dreamless stage of sleep. Then a relatively high proportion of what's here coded in black, which is no conscious experience, reports of having had no experiences whatsoever, which, if we believe the reports, are lights out unconscious. And then there's this intermediate area of conscious experience without recall, or what I've been calling white dreaming, where people say, oh, I think there was something there, but I'm not exactly sure, I can't report any more details. And this is actually it's actually a bit of a conundrum for work on the neural basis of dreaming, because it's not quite clear what to do with these white dream reports from a consciousness perspective. Like, do they still involve conscious experience or not? And does one then group them together with dreaming or with no conscious experience or separately? So it's actually a bit of an important topic in work on the neural correlates of dreaming and of consciousness and sleep. And we can also kind of ask whether white dreaming is similar or different to or different from the gap that Thompson was talking about in the quotations that I read out earlier. Now, for our purposes in regard to minimal phenomenal experience, we can see that white dreaming actually allows for quite different interpretations, or white dream reports actually allow for quite different interpretations as to what kind of conscious experience might or might not underlie these reports or precede these reports. So one interpretation is that people that say that they had an experience but can't report any details, or at least a subgroup of those reports, actually refer to rich and complex dreams where all of the details were forgotten, right? Another possibility, so this is a suggestion that was developed by Peter Fazekas in some very nice recent work, a rare philosophical attempt to discuss white dreaming that I thought was very good, was that there's some kind of low quality dream where imagery was present but degraded and somehow below the threshold for encoding and retrieval. So there was actually imagery present, but it was just not high quality enough to be able to report it after awakening. There's a possibility that there's what I've been calling minimal phenomenal experience, so conscious experience without particular forms of imagery or particular thought contents, in which case the reports would be accurate. So that's the point that I'm trying to get at here. If we have minimal phenomenal experience, the way to accurately report that would be exactly to say, I remember having had an experience, but I'm not able to give any details, the reason being that there were no further details to report in the target experience. Or of course, it's also possible theoretically that people were unconscious and they're just confabulating. And the one we'd be interested in would obviously be this one. Now, it's possible that white dream reports are a mixed bag and that some of them answer to different descriptions here, but at least theoretically this would be the one to be interested in for further research on NPE and sleep. And a way to get at this, again, following Thompson's work on dreamless sleep experience, could be to change your reporting instructions. So Evan observes that most reporting instructions used in dream research are very content focused. So describe any feelings, thoughts, sensations that you had prior to awakening, and then people will give you reports of persons, objects, situations, places they encountered in their dreams. And most dream research tends to tease out exactly that kind of a description. Whereas if we had more phenomenologically focused reporting instructions that really focused on feelings, quality of experience, awareness, and recall, we might be able to get more refined reports of what we now call white dream reports, and we might actually get a better idea of whether details were forgotten or just not experienced in the first place. So that might be one way to make progress. So the last example that I want to give on my tour of candidates for NPE is wild wakefulness. And this is going to take you into research on attentional lapses in wakefulness, which are commonly contrasted from task focus, so really focusing on what you're doing, focusing on the here and now, and observing that according to a number of studies, for up to 30 to 50% of waking in healthy adults, sober adults, we're actually not paying attention to what we're doing, but to something else. And it's a kind of distraction that's not necessarily brought about by anything in the environment, but is conceptualized as self-generated. And this has then given rise in recent years to a real explosion of work on spontaneous thought and mind wandering. And obviously a lot of questions as to how that relates to task performance, but also to affect, emotions, and so on and so forth. And while most of that research is focused on mind wandering, it's now actually becoming clear that when attention lapses and we go off task, we might be having different mental states. So one option is that our minds are wandering and our thoughts are racing, but another option is that our minds are blanking and we're actually thinking of nothing, and we're going into, like when you're zombie driving and you kind of just have a cut and you realize, oh, I got to this point, I didn't realize that. Each of these states are defined in different ways. There's a lot of empirical research, but also a lot of different ways of both defining and operationalizing these different states. There's now an increasing but still very small number of philosophers working on this. So I think a quite interesting area, but roughly mind wandering tends to be defined as either task unrelated thought or as dynamic, associative, unconstrained, freely moving thought, which are not exactly the same. Mind blanking tends to be, so there's a very small literature on mind blanking, and it's sometimes defined as cessation just of task, focus, and thought, but also sometimes as additionally cessation of perception and imagery, or even as cessation of consciousness, which is a bit of a more drastic definition. The one I'll be interested in is roughly this one. So one point being that if we conceive of mind blanking as a reported cessation of perception, imagery, and thought contents, we can basically play exactly the same game or have exactly the same table that I just suggested for different interpretations of mind wandering and how, of white dreaming, and what kind of change in experience might lead to the same type of report. So we could, again, analogously to the table with white dreaming, say, well, maybe there was a rich or complex daydream, but all the details were forgotten, and that then leads to a report of mind blanking because you just can't remember things that you experienced. There could be the low quality daydream that is below the threshold for reporting. There could be minimal phenomenal experience, true mind blanking, that is a reported cessation of perception, imagery, and thought contents would map onto an actual cessation. of perception, imagery, and thought contents that would be an accurate form of report. So that would be the one again that we would be interested here. And just because I mentioned the possibility of unconscious sleep that is later erroneously reported as having involved phenomenal experience, even though it did not, maybe there's that option as well for mind blanking. Maybe people actually lose consciousness, though I find that possibility harder to entertain. And then erroneously confabulate that they were conscious during the episode. And again, I think just as is the case for white dreaming, moving towards more, from content-based towards more phenomenological reporting instructions would be useful. Now, I think, sorry?
15.
Okay, I'm going to just briefly wrap up with one last piece of bit of neuroscience of sleep. And the last step I want to take is then basically changing gears a little bit again, but suggesting that quite possibly mind blanking and mind wandering when they occur in wakefulness might be not just phenomenologically similar to dreaming and dreamless sleep experience, but might actually rely on a similar mechanism, namely sleep-like changes in the brain occurring in wakefulness. So this was work done together with Thomas Andrian and Nao Tsuchiya at Monash. And it's looking at, so I'll just try and be quite, keep this simple. It's relying on a quite interesting development in sleep research in recent years, which looks at local sleep. So local sleep is often defined as slow wave activity, slow waves being the defining feature of the deepest stages of allegedly dreamless non-REM sleep. So really traditionally seen as a hallmark of sleep. But then the finding is that slow wave activity can occur in all stages of sleep, including rapid eye movement sleep, but also can occur in wakefulness. And they're called, so here you see wake slow waves and how similar they can be to sleep slow waves. And what is interesting is, or what makes it local sleep, is that these slow waves occur locally in time and locally in space. So they don't occur across the whole brain, but in small neuronal assemblies in just over a few seconds. Local sleep seems to increase with time spent awake. It's also use dependent, so it's going to occur in parts of the brain that were previously involved in, for example, a certain type of task. And that also seems to be correlated to objective performance. So local sleep in certain areas of the brain will be associated with poorer performance. And the question that we wanted to ask is whether there's also some association with changes in subjective experience when part of the brain, as it were, falls asleep. Now, I think this local sleep, I think, is a quite interesting concept for a philosopher, because it kind of suggests that we really radically have to rethink how sleep and wakefulness relate to each other. They're not global states. It seems to be somewhat disturbing that part of the brain can be asleep when the rest is awake, and it kind of raises interesting questions about who or what is actually asleep or awake, because we thought it was supposed to be persons, but apparently it's parts of brains, and how we really want to make sense of that, but that just as an aside. It's also really a mereological fallacy, if you follow that. But so here's what we did. We had participants engage in a fairly boring go, no-go task, so they just had to press a button in response to certain numbers. And then we interrupted them roughly every minute to ask what kind of experience they were undergoing, so task focus, mind blanking, or mind wandering. And what we found was that when they were mind wandering, their behavior became more impulsive, so they made a different kind of mistake as compared to when they were either mind blanking or focused on task. So more commission errors, and also they showed local sleep in the front of the head. Whereas when they were mind blanking, their behavior became more sluggish. So different profile of behavioral errors and local sleep in the back of the head. So almost suggesting that when different parts of the brain fall asleep, you're going to be engaging. So basically local sleep will predict attentional lapses and poorer performance, But where it occurs in the brain, if this is correct, will predict what kind of mistake people make and also what kind of change in experience they're undergoing. And then the next interesting question would be then to relate that more broadly to dreaming and dreamless sleep. So then to wrap up, we've looked at 4 types of examples: so mind blanking, white dreaming, different goal states and different meditation practices, and witnessing, dreamless sleep, lucid dreamless sleep, if you want to call it that. And relating back to my initial question, so are there different kinds of empty minds? It seems there is at least broad similarity across all of these different conditions and states, and variability that seems to occur both within but also across these different conditions, at least as a rough superficial characterization. Progress could be made through more, I think, phenomenologically focused rather than content-focused questions, just because the nature of the state that we're looking at. And I think the next step to take really would be more systematic contrasts between these different, both sleep and wakefulness and wild and cultivation, and really looking at them together rather than drawing piecemeal from different studies. Questions one could then ask in more detail would be things like, well, is MPE in sleep simpler than in waking? So is there something about sleep that makes phenomenal experience even simpler, even more reduced than wakefulness? Or are they actually the same? Are there any systematic differences between wild and cultivated MPEs? Again, if there were, that would be a reason for maybe saying, well, there are different kinds of empty minds. If there weren't, in more systematic studies from the same participants, then we would lean towards the single common kind answer that I am currently favoring, but that's more of an intuition. And we could also look at neurophysiological similarities and differences across conditions. So for instance, is local sleep in different parts of the head going to underlie MPE across states? Which is a bit interesting. I mean, especially if you're projecting that to to meditation, contentless experience as part of the brain falling asleep. When people have these goal states in meditation, that would seem to be diametrically opposed, right, to what Metzinger says and to what the whole tradition of regarding those as wakefulness. So that might be a bit interesting to look at. But also, what are potential phenomenological substages of all of those? And with that, thanks for your attention, and also just a brief advertisement for our journal, Philosophy in the Mind Sciences. If you do work in this area, we're open access and free of charge for authors and readers. But yeah, with that, thanks to you, and thanks to my collaborators for all of this.
Just wanted to ask you a couple of things. The first one is this idea of maybe content, which goes against strongly my experience in the forest monasteries. Because what you hear in the forest monasteries are constant loud sounds, and what the loud sounds are people falling over. So the monks in Wat Pa Pong and Wat Pa Nanochet, the major of the 6, they're constantly, you're sitting there most of the time, a loud spell, and somebody's falling over. And how they explain it is there's initially the transitive stage, which we have that Harold's spoken about, and mathematically that Paul has spoken about, where there's a noting at that stage because it's, as William James talks about. But there has to be a condition which exists where there's receptivity for what possibly can come outside the cultivated mind. So therefore people fall over. I mean, they have all sorts of names for them, like samadhi being an example. So I don't know if that can go forward on the, as a proposition. I've seen it so many times, that constant falling over you, and you speak to them after, and they say, well, they just blanked out prior to having their peak experience. So it's important to me because that's the basis of my research as well. How often people go into these states of samadhi. You could walk over and hit them on the head with a brick and they wouldn't feel you're saying, can you possibly then think of a dream just objectively as dreaming, as opposed to dreaming for some process? We know they're stored in the amygdala, and then eventually they make their way through hypnopompic state. But sometimes somebody will come in and say, I have one vision of a dream. I was standing in an alleyway. I can't remember anything else. You think, well, why did that possibly come through? What about the rest? What about the long, they might have a dream that goes on. So I wonder how, I read that research all the time, and I love your journal, as I've already expressed to you, but I wonder how one can actually look at that kind of characteristic without actually giving some purpose to it. If there's no purpose, yes, I accept that fully. But we see from dreams, of course, they obviously are purposeful. So two points I wanted to make.
Yeah, I'm not going to answer either of those, but I'll try to say something about them. So firstly, for the samadhi, thanks for that. I honestly don't know how I would respond to that in more detail. I think that's just a really interesting thing that I would like to hear more about and think about more. I guess I would want to know whether in that state there is it possible to get a phenomenological description of that state, basically, and what is happening there, and kind of also coming back to a lot of the stuff that Ruben was talking about, like, is that actually still a state that can be described as being a phenomenal state in some meaningful sense or not? Like, it's tempting to say they're just blacking out, but I think that might also not do justice to what is happening there, so I think that would
In interviews with them,
beyond that, yeah.
They talk about it as a complete emptying of any cultivation that they had. So it's the only way in which because they're completely cultivated in the Sayadaw tradition he was talking about, and other traditions, every monk and every person who meditates is cultivated. I'm not sure about the stillness. So they refer to it when they've interviewed them as this a really necessary state, because at that point I just completely feel that the cultivation's gone, and then I'm free to see what the next insight is. Without that, I'd be stuck. Anyway.
So that would almost be a post-cultivation state, or maybe
Absolutely.
even, and that would be very interesting to think about whether that is then, how that then relates to that
Right.
rough distinction. That would be super interesting. The other question about the purpose and function of dreaming, so that would be the holy grail, right, of large parts of dream, but also of sleep research. So even so far, people can't agree on a function of dreaming. They can't even agree on a function of sleep. I would add that they can't even agree on a definition of sleep. So there would be much more to say about that. The thing that I would say, so I don't personally endorse any particular purpose or function, evolutionary function of dreams. I've seen nothing that convinced me, though there are a lot of interesting proposals out there. The only thing that I would say about that is, or feel comfortable saying about that, is that a lot of the work, at least on the evolutionary function of dreaming, tends to regard it as something that we really need to dream in order to have. So that's kind of how that logic of that question seems to progress, is that is something that that dreaming has a dedicated function that we will not get from other areas. And one thing that I'm interested in there, and that's where I do the philosophical trick of avoiding the answer, is that if we regard dreaming as something very separate from waking experience, it makes sense to ask the question in that way. Whereas what I'm leaning towards in this, but also in other work, is really much more in line with saying, well, look, there's a continuity of experiences that occur across the sleep-wake cycle. And the way we carve up mental states is not strictly aligned with the behavioral states of sleep and wakefulness in which they occur. And there's not necessarily just continuity in terms which many other people are saying right now in regard to the mind-wandering literature, and the sense, for example, of dreaming being an intensified form of mind-wandering, both in a phenomenological and a neurophysiological sense. But it's quite possible that we can experience states in what we now call sleep and waking, neurophysiologically defined, that are actually exactly analogous regardless of the behavioral state of sleep or wake in which they occur. And if that is the case, and I mean beyond that, I think also with all of the local sleep stuff, in particular, the definition of sleep stages and sleep and wakefulness themselves are moving around right now and getting quite messy, which is something I find quite exciting. So if that is the type of view you take, I think that changes how you think about questions about the functions and purpose of dreaming as well, because one can now no longer ask, well, is that a function that is fulfilled exclusively by dreaming and sleep, because dreaming is now no longer necessarily something that exclusively occurs in sleep. So I think it's just changing with a lot of the stuff that I'm doing. It's really prior to answering that question, but I think it changes how we think about that question. So I guess that's
Well, there are vision.
what I would say
all sorts
about
of
that.
Other things which are waking phenomena.
Or maybe a very immersive daydreams, dependent on how you define dreaming.
Just
Yeah.
viewing these things symbolically in some way that you can do at any time. I have a quite a big lineup now, so I have Chris, Ruben, and then I have Ian.
Cool, thanks.
I can do
yes.
mine later if we run out of time. I'll do mine later.
So, thanks, Jenny. Fascinating. With the white dreaming reports, you said if they're having MPE, then the reports are accurate. On the face of it, that seems inconsistent with your common kind hypothesis, because the sort of MPE experiences that meditators are having, there's a lot more to say about them than just something was happening, right? It's calm, it's peaceful, it's blissful, it's joyful.
Yeah, I think that is true. The white dreaming stuff, one problem is that it's really turning out to be quite a problem in a lot of this research on the neural correlates of consciousness and dreaming in sleep. But there's very inconsistent definitions and ways of asking for it across different studies. So I think that honestly there is at this stage not much more to be said about it. I mean, one possibility which I think would be very interesting is that there is actually quite a bit more to be said, right? Some things that we now call white dream reports might turn out to be ones where people say, no, I had this really detailed dream that I just now can't remember, in which case it also won't be MPE. It could also be that there is that some of those things that we see associated with alleged MPE cases in meditation, for instance, do they also characterize white dreaming? Maybe they're actually quite pleasant. Maybe there are actually subtle aspects of phenomenology that we can get at that would be either similar or different to what we see in reports coming from different areas, but that work just hasn't been done. So I would regard that more as something that should be investigated, or would be interesting to investigate in more detail, but it's so far just, I mean, many studies won't, I mean, currently the granularity at which it is investigated is more saying that some studies will just group it as, well, there's no report, it's unconscious, versus others will say, oh, it's just alongside dreaming. So it's a very messy field at this stage, but that's possible. I think another question that is really relevant for the common kind idea is whether the affective qualities, so things like calm, bliss, joy, is that part of how we want to carve up the target mental state, or is that separate from it? So do we want to say that being a common kind of empty-mindedness or MPE across these different states, does that depend on whether it was calm and blissful versus disturbing, or just maybe sluggish and bland? Or is that not part of the relevant properties? And I currently don't really have a strong position on that, but I would just say that that is a separate way in which one would have to think about this, whether that goes into our mental state taxonomy or not, and I'm not clear about that.
Wakefulness is the other one that occurred to me, which is
Yeah.
obviously affective.
Yeah. Well, I think that's also super interesting in Thomas Metzinger's view of MPE, where he really says quite strongly there's a phenomenology of wakefulness that underlies minimal phenomenal experience. Part of me is always really confused as to what that is, because I'm coming from this whole area of sleep and dreaming, and also of thinking of wakefulness and sleep as electrophysiologically defined states and behavioral states. So part of me, most of me doesn't really believe that there is a phenomenology of wakefulness, but there is clearly a phenomenology that people describe as being one of wakefulness. So what exactly that is would also be a really interesting thing to think about in relation to all of this stuff. So, yeah.
Yeah, first of all, sorry for not acknowledging you for MPE. I had no
No,
idea.
it's-
So,
It
that's
was a
amazing.
commentary on someone else's work. It's
Oh,
very
yeah, still.
missable.
It's a great idea, the MP framing. And then, yeah, I have lots of things for us to talk about later, I think. But I do also want to push back against the common kind thing, especially in the case of like mind blanking versus the kinds of reports, let's say, that Metzinger is getting. I mean,
Yeah.
everyone who's had those MPE experiences have also had mind blanking, and they will tell you they are like two ends of a spectrum. It's like quite completely the opposite of each other in a way. So maybe they might have that one common characteristic, but otherwise it's very hard, I think, to bring them together. And then maybe for further discussion, just now I had four things, that I think are concretely different states that I think also are that Thomas Metzinger tends to lump in, but I think are very different. And that is what I would consider this MPE state, which is more like in Theravada, it's like the signless state or pure presence, or these light consciousness experiences, wakefulness, boundless point of consciousness experiences. I think that's one category of things. Then I think there's this more fundamental nothingness, unconditioned, beyond groundless ground, or in Buddhism, nibbana thing, which is different because there's not any light. There's none of the wakefulness qualities are present there, and they're not in the descriptions either. So if you take, for example, Mahasi Sayadaw's non-occurrence, or Nisargadatta's beyond being and non-being, these sorts of things. And then you have cessation, which was described over here, where there's a complete lapse in any conscious experience at all, a total gap where one can fall over, which gives the space perhaps for what I just described before to happen. So these are all there. And then there's a final thing maybe, which is this reflexive non-dual awareness, which is what, for example, Zoran Josipovic talks about, where there can be an awareness without subject and object with contents present. For example, then there's the reflexive non-dual awareness of sleep, or different stages of sleep, or even with really advanced practitioners in their day-to-day life that they report. And so all of these somehow, for me, seem like very different things, but also are all kind of minimal phenomenal events, if not experiences.
Yeah, I think that's great, and I think there are a lot of moving parts in pretty much everything you say. So I mean, firstly, the different, even what you said at the end with awareness of different stages of sleep. I mean, there's, I think, from my very limited understanding of like sleep awareness, clear light of sleep, clear light of dreams type of thing. I mean, what is considered there as a stage of sleep is going to be very different from what is from conventional sleep staging in sleep research, which is also subject to change and in many ways quite arbitrary and really purely conventional. So I think one big interest that I have in the background and that I've been trying to work out in other work is how we could use, have more phenomenologically clean, a more phenomenologically informed mapping of experience changes in sleep to sleep stages as they are electrophysiologically defined, which was the original project of distinguishing REM and non-REM sleep, for instance. So all of that is kind of subject to very different conventions and uses and staging criteria. I think the thing about the common kind assumption, I think it's a useful assumption to make for the purposes of comparing these states initially. I think it's a more interesting one because it's outrageous, right? I mean, to say that in a way that these states that people have been cultivating and working on and that have all of these other properties might just occur spontaneously. I think I like the common kind assumption because it's a bit outrageous and interesting in that regard, because I think it opens up the path for comparing these different states. I think there's a real question, as I said in response to Chris, as to what are the relevant properties that we want to use up to really taxonomize different mental states. There could be still something common that underlies them across those examples, and I would still be happy to say, well, maybe it's a different kind of state, but there's still some common ingredient that we're going to find in mind blanking versus allegedly contentless goal states, taking into account that there's a lot of variation there. But I think one other thing is that mind blanking, much as is the case for mind wandering, for white dreaming, has not been studied in that much detail. So there are just really not that many studies that have looked at it, and they're quite phenomenologically superficial. So again, it's possible, and I guess that's all that I'd be interested in really getting across. I think there's at least a meaningful question to ask as to whether analogs of whatever is occurring in meditators might also just pop up spontaneously in untrained people just out of the blue and what I've been calling in the wild. And it could be that a lot of that is sluggish and totally different, but it could be that some of what goes under that heading of mind blanking is actually not that different in some of the ways that count. And I think it's at least interesting to look.
I totally think it's interesting to look, but it's also maybe, I'm curious what would convince you that they are different. Like maybe it's that they need to be neuro and physiologically really different, which I think there's okay evidence of that. And the other way to probably look at this is, or possibly look at this, is that there's a pre, during, and post also, and look at it in a more temporally extended sense, and to dissociate or associate them that way. And I think there's really big differences also in the pre, during, and post phases as well.
Well, it could also be that looking at them in isolation as a momentary occurrence is just the wrong way of thinking about certain states, right? That you can't pluck them out of context in that way. That could also be the case, but that'd be worth knowing.
Well, thanks.
So this is the first time I've ever actually heard of white dreaming. Never heard of it before, but I actually undergo it fairly regularly. Like if what you described is what dreaming is, I think I have that pretty regularly, not like a lot, but a decent amount of the time. I also, my mind blanks completely, constantly. It's really annoying. I have ADD that I take medication for, that I suspect is related to that. But I definitely can say that the experience of white dreaming, if what I'm experiencing is white dreaming, in the sense that I wake up and I'm like, I had a dream, but I just can't remember what it was about. I know I had a dream. Like, I know I had a dream, but I can't place it. But that feeling, at least to me, is completely different from the mind blanking one. Mind blanking one is like, God, why the hell did I walk into this room? And it's the mind blanking one, to me anyway, is more of there's like a clear cut. It's like a very clear, and in fact, there are even times when I literally experience it. Like, I will be saying to myself, okay, I need to remember this, and I'll start saying it over and over to myself. Okay, remember this. You gotta take the dog out. And I'll be saying that to myself, and I'll literally, as I'm doing that, feel the thought slip away. And then I'm like, shit, what am I doing here? and it's gone. Even though and I can feel it slipping away, and I'm like, wait, I gotta hold on to that thought. I want to hold that. That doesn't happen with the white dreaming, though. It's a completely different kind of experience. So I was just a comment.
Yeah, super interesting. I mean, I think that kind of thing would be useful to look at, and that's kind of exactly what I think would be useful to look at in more detail from the same participants, and then also the variation within that.
Maybe
I mean,
just
also, yeah.
quick question though. Then, so that does bring up a question. Then, have you ever this idea of feeling the thought slipping away? Have you ever heard people report that? And what is that? Like what are you, like just feeling that thought just slipping away? You ever heard anybody say that they've experienced that?
Is it, I'm not too sure, a tip of the tongue type of things come to mind, but that seems to be a little bit of a different phenomenology
this
as
is
well,
like
so I'm not
this
too,
is like I'm aware
yeah.
of the thought starting to slip away.
Miriam,
I'm actually happy to wait till we can talk about mine later.
okay. I think is it really short?
Yes,
I
it
think
is.
we're in the-
It's actually for both of them. But I had a question for you, and now it came up later with you, is how about cultural and epoch specificity? In other words, you're talking about a general model, presuming that all of us who are bound by skin, independent of our culture or our age, all understand ourselves the same way, or can respond objectively to data, and there's a common basis here. First of all. Second question related to that is
That's sneaky.
that if you're going to do this behaviorally, as you insist, you know, that you're going, I mean, that it's important to actually look at physical data, then don't you have to take animals, especially primates, into consideration as well?
So I don't think I have a quick answer to that. I think the question, I mean, look, it's a common problem that I think we have in all of psychology, really, to say, look, a lot of this could be culturally specific. It changes over time. I mean, almost all of psychology is done with weird people, right? So it's, I mean, 20-year-old white educated democratic psych students. I mean, it's completely insufficient. I mean, I think all it is a starting point, really. The battle that I'm picking is even just to say, let's at least probably still be looking at a fairly weird and limited population at a certain point in time, but across different conscious states, rather than in isolation. So that's kind of my main target, but I completely take your point that looking across cultures and times, of course, I mean, that should ideally be part of the picture. It's a lot harder to pull off. There's been, I mean, some work at least, but that goes way beyond for, things that dreams that people have, typical dreams that people have, and are they the same or different across different cultures, some stuff on sleeping patterns. I'm happy to chat about that more over coffee, but that's a very partial answer to that. I think the thing with primates and looking at animals, I mean, my gut is, for a lot of what I mean, do they have mind wandering? Do they have things like dreaming and mind blanking? I would assume they would have something reasonably similar, but given that I'm deploring the way phenomenology, the lack of precise phenomenology in humans, I don't see how that's going to help me for those particular questions. So for a whole array of theoretical and ethical reasons, I would much prefer to be doing this with humans. And I think that will get me closer to what I want. I wouldn't say it's a purely behavioral project, because I would exactly not want to say that we can infer either from conventionally defined sleep or wake stages what conscious state a person is in, or that we could directly infer that from behavior. I think we need to ask the subjective question, and I think that is something that we really should have learned from the history of sleep and dream and mind-wandering research is that changes in conscious state don't necessarily align with changes in behavioral states and also in behavioral performance. They often correlate with them, but we precisely can't do it without the questionnaire. So that is something I would push back against.
Thank you.